Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Storybox, where I, your host, Jay Phantom, has the utmost privilege and honor to unbox the amazing stories of some incredible people from all walks of life and experiences. I'm delighted and grateful that you're here today. Now let's dive into the Storybox and hear more about our guest today. I guess continuing our conversation from yesterday, got quite a few more questions for you. So I guess what we're talking about yesterday was the addiction side of things and mindfulness, and how mindfulness really helps and shapes getting and moving forward from addiction. But I wanted to ask you as well about the hardest addiction there is to overcome. Is there one? And what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat individual. From a chemical standpoint, there are some. So, for example, cigarette smoking has a lot of unique characteristics that actually make it one of the hardest addictions to quit. So, for example, you can smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. You can reinforce that habit 20 times a day. Whereas with alcohol, it's hard. It's hard to get drunk 20 times a day and repeat that day after day after day. The other thing is you can smoke cigarettes and still be functional, cognitively and whatnot. Whereas, drinking alcohol or smoking crack cocaine or using heroin all the time, it tends to render people pretty non-functional. So that's an aspect. There are chemical aspects related to cigarettes being very addictive. For example, all the capillary beds, the small blood vessels in the lungs, if you line them up next to each other, they're going to fill either a tennis court or a football field. So the surface area is in the lungs is unbelievable, which makes it a really good drug delivery system, which is why crack cocaine is more addictive than freebasing injecting cocaine. And even much more so than snorting cocaine, because you have very small capillary beds in the nose. So that leads to a huge and rapid rise of cocaine in the bloodstream, which then is proportional to the increase in dopamine in the brain. And so that makes it very addictive. Same for nicotine. When you can smoke a cigarette, you can get nicotine in there very quickly, which leads to large spikes of dopamine when it crosses the blood-brain barrier and affects the nicotine acetylcholine receptor. So I would say from a chemical standpoint, probably cigarettes are, if not one of the most addictive, or at least hardest habits to quit. I would say there's a difference between something being very addictive and something being really challenging to break a habit. I've had patients who've gotten addicted to heroin after a single use. Whereas people, when they smoke a single cigarette, the first time they smoke it, they tend to get sick because it's a toxin. And they have to actually build it, kind of force themselves to smoke enough until they build up their tolerance. So that's how I think of it. But really, if you expand this to the spectrum of continued use despite adverse consequences, what I would say the hardest addiction to quit is whatever somebody's addiction is that they're really addicted to. So it's somewhat of a personal thing as well. Some people, it's easier for them to quit drinking alcohol than other people, and this has to do with personal, probably genetic polymorphisms, as well as context, where somebody had a specific, event or series of events that really locked in their addiction. It makes it really hard for them to quit. As an example, they used to give K rations in World War II. So along with chocolate bars and food in people's, in the soldiers' food, they gave them, I think it was 4 cigarettes a meal or something like that. So that was their K rations. So the cigarette companies were really smart. They knew if you associate cigarette smoking with somebody putting them, in a literally life and death situation, and they get addicted to those things, they're going to come home and they're going to smoke the rest of their life. So they have, it was a small sacrifice for this quote unquote sacrifice for them to offer up cigarettes to the U.S. Army, for example, knowing that all those folks are going to come home and be addicted.
Wow. So I know moving towards, I guess, fixing this kind of addiction and figuring out, you mentioned there the chemical imbalance. I know that my uncle smoked for a long period of time. And when he eventually quit, it was almost like shock therapy. So my grandfather had a heart attack. No, so he had a stroke and he also had a heart attack. But it was also the fear of losing his now wife, because she told him, if you continue smoking, we won't be together. So he had to make a choice, quit cold turkey, or continue doing it and lose my now auntie. So I'm curious about this possibility of actually, is it just, okay, the will to actually quit, or is there something more to it than that? Because like, I know it's hard for people to actually quit smoking in general, because I got a couple of friends of mine that actually would smoke, but they've transitioned that addiction to something else.
Right. And that's often the case. I see this a lot with a bunch of different types of addictions where people will substitute exercise. That's a big one that I see, where they'll become an exercise junkie as compared to a, a heroin junkie or an alcohol junkie or something like that. So this really, if it were as simple as just using our willpower, I could just tell my patients to quit smoking and they'd quit. I could just tell my patients to stop overeating and they'd stop overeating. And boy, would it be great for me to have to find another line of work. But unfortunately, my clinic is pretty full because it's so hard, to quit addictions. And there's this, I don't know where this heuristic started, but there's this strong reliance on willpower. Yet the neuroscience is suggesting that willpower is weak at best. The prefrontal cortex, where the seat of willpower is the weakest part of the brain. It's the first that goes offline when we get stressed, all this stuff. So you can't really rely on it to change behavior. Yet it seems to be something that we go to. If you look at Weight Watchers, for example, they say, well, if you just, I think they have a point system now or something like this. You can eat whatever you want up to these number of points and then just stop for the day. And it works, calories in, calories out. The formula is correct. But then they can blame people for failing, not blame themselves for failing the people. But the truth is that's not how our brains work. Our brains learn based on rewards. That's why it's called reward-based learning. So really, if you want to change behavior for good, you have to actually get at that reward-based learning mechanism. So this is where mindfulness comes in and really gets at that root, at that core mechanism, where we have people pay attention as they eat, as they smoke, as they get anxious, whatever. And what they start to see, cigarettes don't taste very good. And what that does is it helps update that reward value in their brain. Because it got laid down, for smokers, the typical person, at least in my studies, has started smoking at the age of 13, and they lay it down and they're just habitually smoking. So when we have them pay attention as they smoke, we had a guy who'd been smoking 40 years. He'd reinforced this process 293,000 times. We calculated it out. And I had him pay attention when he smoked, and he's like, how did I not notice this? Well, it's because it's habitual. You don't notice when you're walking down the street because it's a habit. You know how to walk. And habits can be helpful from a survival perspective, but they can also be unhelpful if we've kind of laid them down, like smoking or overeating. So the first thing we have to do is kind of update that reward value. And the way to do that is to bring awareness to the actual behavior so you can see how rewarding it is right now. Once somebody does that, and we've actually done studies where it takes as few as 10 to 15 times of somebody doing this, whether they're overeating or smoking, for that reward value to significantly drop. We can even model this out mathematically. Once that reward value drops of the current behavior, it opens up the door for what I call the bigger, better offer, the BBO. And there's a part of our brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that actually stores and updates reward value. And so it's always looking for the BBO. Think of broccoli versus chocolate. Your brain's like, chocolate, of course, right? Or my brain, it's got a very, very nuanced hierarchy of chocolate, 40% chocolate, no, I won't touch it. It's got to be at least 70%. And then you add in sea salt and a little cayenne pepper, almonds, whatever. So, our brains are always looking for that bigger, better offer. And let's use your uncle as an example. Not that I've ever met the guy, but as a hypothetical, he was being given a choice: smoke or be with my sweetheart. And so the sweetheart was the bigger, better offer.
Yes.
And so there he can say, well, here's the choice. And it's not, and I don't know how he quit, but sometimes people, they'll actually keep in mind the person that they're quitting for. And I've had a number of patients who quit for their kids. They have a newborn kid and they want to quit smoking, or they want to lose weight because they know they're at an unhealthy weight. And so they'll keep their kid in mind. And so when they bring their kid to mind versus smoking a cigarette, especially when they see that smoking a cigarette tastes crappy, it's much easier for them to naturally move toward that bigger, better offer. The other thing that mindfulness can do is help people write out cravings. So if they have a craving for a certain junk food or a cigarette, they can start to notice what those cravings actually feel like. Oh, it's tightness, it's tension, it's burning, it's whatever. And they can see that these are just thoughts, emotions, physical sensations that come and go. And then that way they don't, they're like, oh, I can, in this moment, tightness, it's not going to make my head explode. Okay, I can be with this. And they can be with these cravings as they rise and then as they go away.
So when it comes down to habits versus addictions, how can people actually determine and distinguish between, if I asked you this before, I apologize, but determining the distinction between, okay, I've just got a bad habit, whereas it might be an addiction?
To me, they're really along the same spectrum, and it's probably, the differentiation is probably not that important.
Yep.
The definition that I learned in residency training of addiction is continued use despite adverse consequences. So, bad habit can be continued use and, despite adverse consequences, and an addiction can be continued use despite adverse consequences. So to me, it's really, how adverse are the consequences, and that determines how far down the spectrum, this is. And it's somewhat of just a semantic thing at that point, whether you call it a habit or an addiction, it's still causing adverse consequences.
So about that and curing addictions, can we fully cure it, or are we just a creature of habit that we're going to eventually fall back into it?
Well, we are creatures of habit, right? Habits help us survive. And if we are thoroughly disenchanted with the old behavior and we're more enchanted with the new behavior, we're not going to fall back into it. Or even if we do lapse for a minute or a moment, we're going to be like, oh, that wasn't so good. Why did I do that? Oh, habit. And then we're able to drop it.
So do you think that we were designed somewhat to actually form bad habits?
Well, we are certainly, we've evolved to form habits. And I would say the modern day environment has created the conditions for bad habits. Before there was processed sugar, before people started manufacturing, for example, coca leaves, right? For indigenous people in Central and South America, coca leaves were actually really helpful for them. Cocaine, not so much. But so it was when people started refining coca leaves into cocaine that it became a problem. Eating corn, it's a vegetable. But when you pull out all the syrup and you've got corn syrup, it's a cavity producer, and it's obesogenic, causes people, if you eat a bunch of corn syrup, it's not good for you. So I think it's really the modern day environment where we've been able to refine things and distill out these things that really jack our dopamine system. That's when we started getting into bad habits.
I want to ask you as well, have there been any people that you have not been able to help with their addiction?
There are certainly people that really, really struggle. And, fortunately our clinical studies, like for example, with anxiety have been gangbusters. We're getting like 63% reduction in people with generalized anxiety disorder.
Wow.
So as people, but that's on average, and some people do better and some people do worse. So certainly in my clinic, I've got patients who have relapsed and they've struggled. But each time, if they can bow to that, I think of it as bowing to whatever it is as a teacher. They can learn from it. And every learning moment is a step forward. And so in that sense, some people think, oh, one step forward, two step backwards. I would say if you learn from something, nothing is a step backwards, because it's always going to move you forward. And in that sense, we often learn more from our failures than our successes.
Oh, yes. I always say that in failure, you learn humility. You learn more about yourself. And
Yes.
you're at this point of your life where you can't go any further. So you literally got to stop and smell the roses, as it were. And just, it's the best place to learn and
Yes.
see yourself, really. Yeah.
And in that sense, we can redefine and start asking the question, like, what is failure? Because if you're learning, is that failure? No, you're learning.
It's a different mindset, like looking at failure as a positive rather than a negative, which is what a lot of people actually do. And I got stuck in it because, when you fail, it hurts for a moment, but it's only for a moment. And then you start seeing the growth after it. And that's for me, that's the most amazing thing. And that's where I came up with the humility aspect, because you're at that lowest point of your life, but humility is the key to actually absorbing information, because you're not at this egotistical or proud level that you think that you are too good to learn. You think, and I think a lot of people as well. I know for me, because I struggle with, I had like binge eating, addiction, and all these other things that sort of stemmed out of my porn addiction from when I was 12 years old. And once I got control of that, you're right, it shifted to another addiction, which was my body, health, binge eating, everything like that. So what I realized in that moment was my pride. I thought that I was better than the addiction. But I realized that I wasn't. And I needed to just get to this place of, okay, letting go, allowing other people to tell me and to help me get over these addictions, and making myself accountable to somebody else, which helped me tremendously. But it was that point of, it was hard to actually realize that I did have an addiction. And a lot of people, I feel like they do struggle with that. They struggle with the knowing aspect of it. And I think with pride and ego, that's such a big addiction in of itself, because it's so.
Yes. Yeah. I wrote a whole chapter in my book, The Craving Mind, on basically addicted to self. And there was a whole other chapter on addicted to thinking, where we often think, we love to think, and then we get caught up in our own ideas, and then get caught up in our own views. And then, look where this world is with so many people caught up in views.
It's all about
and it actually, yeah, it really is. It really is. And it even, it highlights an aspect of mindsets that Carol Dweck, who is an educational researcher at Stanford, wrote a book about, called Growth Mindset. So, fixed mindset is literally what it sounds like. We've got a fixed idea of how things are. And she studied this in the setting of education, but I think this applies much more broadly. And then there's growth mindset, where we're open, and you've got to be humble. You need humility to be in growth mindset. So it even highlights those differences between those two mindsets, when we're stuck in our own selves, believing, what's that phrase? Don't believe your own hype. And there's this, if you look at some of the ancient psychology, the Buddhist psychology, there's this image of what's called a hungry ghost.
Yes.
So you can imagine, you might have heard of this, but just for your listeners, there's this ghost with a big mouth, a very thin, narrow, long esophagus and a huge belly. And the idea is no matter how much it eats, it's never satisfied because it can never fill its belly. And this is true for literally stress eating, but also true for, our trying to have a perception, put a perception out there and support that. It's like we always need more likes and we need more retweets and we need more and more and more and more. And we're so caught up in the process of trying to do that we lose sight of the fact that it's not actually very satisfying. It's emptiness provoke, or it really supports this feeling of emptiness and not enoughness and not good enoughness.
It's like this vicious cycle that keeps going around and around and around, and it won't break unless you break it for yourself.
Right. Yeah. Right. And this comes back to habits where we have to stop and ask ourselves, what am I getting from this? I have my patients do this a lot. When they're smoking a cigarette, what am I getting from this? When they're overeating, what am I getting from this? When they're anxious and worrying for the 18th time about something, what am I getting from this? They've got to see how unrewarding it is. Yet at the same time, they also have to be able to see, find something that is more rewarding. So here, I love, there's this attitudinal quality of mindfulness, which is curiosity. And, we can start to even embrace curiosity as that bigger, better offer. I've had people in our anxiety program who can actually write out full-blown panic attacks by getting curious about those sensations, because that is the bigger, better offer. So here, we've got to see how unrewarding it is to try to, get a social image out there and how much is enough, how much money is enough, how much power is enough, how much social media fame is enough. It's never enough. The famous quote, John D. Rockefeller, I think, one of the richest guys in the US back in the day, it said, how much is enough? And he said, just a little bit more.
Yeah.
So that's never enough. And then also we've got to see how rewarding it feels to be content, to be connected, to be kind, to be curious. Those are things that never run out, and they never, you don't get addicted to kindness.
Yeah.
It'd be great if we did.
Amen. Yeah. If the world was just a little bit more kinder, how much different would it be? And especially if they're a little bit more patient as well with people. Patience, kindness, and gratitude, I think, are the three pillars for just changing the world for a more positive place, really.
Which require the, you mentioned it earlier, humility. I think humility is really key for all of those. Because it's like, if to be patient, we have to not be so caught up in ourselves. Like, I want this now. Well, a little humility helps us learn to be patient. Kindness, same thing, a little humility. If we say something that's mean, it's much easier to apologize and be kind to somebody. So, I think humility underlies a lot of this.
Oh, definitely. I was always brought up believing that curiosity was bad for me, because that old saying, curiosity killed the cat, right? So I was always told that if you are curious, you got to be curious about this. You can't be extra curious about this. You know what I mean? Like, it's always, you're told, you're spoon-fed all the information that you are conditioned to believe. You can't be more curious about that. And what I found was that I was extra curious, but I was always shut down. I was always discouraged about asking the deeper questions. And then oftentimes everyone would tell me all this information. I'd just be like, why? Why is that? And there'd be I don't know if they're trying to protect me as such, or they're just trying to shield me from the reality of the world. But I eventually saw it for what it was later on. And I saw it. And the moment I saw it, Dr. Judd, it was like this moment of realization. I was like, far out. I've been stripped of so much in my life. And learning about habits, learning about addictions, learning about reasons why, learning about humility, learning about kindness. It all happened at once. And I was like, I've got to process all this.
Mm.
It was crazy. And it's one thing that I've learned through all of this as well, by speaking to amazing people like yourself, is that number one, it's humility. Number two, it's kindness. Number three is be persistent to remain consistent. Otherwise, you won't do anything else. And the last one was be the sort of person that, or treat other people how you want to be treated as well. And that's that mindfulness thing and that idea as well.
Yes.
So I kind of forgot where I was going with that. But anyway, a couple more questions for you, Doc, if you don't mind. And that is, what is your greatest achievement so far?
Oh, I don't know how many achievements I'd really consider great. But yes, I'm not sure how I would answer that. My lab's discovered a few things that have been helpful. We've developed some apps that seem to be clinically useful and potentially very helpful for things like overeating and anxiety in a way that's different than what's been out there previously. So I would probably say, the reach of our digital therapeutics and being part of the early folks that were starting to define, study, and test these things. We started our first digital therapeutic back in 2012, I think, way before that term was even invented. So I would say, that, and then just trying to make the science that my lab studies accessible to people. This is where I've been, writing books. I just finished writing my second book. That's actually going to be focused on anxiety and habit change. And then put out a bunch of YouTube videos and short animations to help explain a lot of science to people. And that's, I wouldn't call that a great thing, but seems like these things are helpful for people. And so that's what that's how I would answer that question.
That's good. I think you're the first one that answered it that way. And they're trying to actually really think about what is great, what is greatness in their life. And I think that's very important for people to hear. And my last question for you, Doc, this is my legacy question that I love asking people at the end. And that is, you've reached the age of 100 and your friends have put together a mixtape for you, or a video if you want, of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how they got it, they just did. And they put it together for you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that mixtape or film to say and show about your life?
It would be pretty short, and I would hope that it would say something like, this guy learned, this guy was constantly curious, and he left the world a better place than coming into it.
Powerful.
Something like that.
Very powerful. Well, Dr. Judd, you've been an awesome person to speak to. You've been very informative. I just want to say thank you. I'm grateful for your time today and round two. Really appreciate your insight into this world of addiction and habits and mindfulness as well. So I know a lot of people are going to get quite a bit of information from it. Where can people find you?
I have a website that's just drjud.com, DRJUD. Also have a YouTube channel, same name, Dr. Judd. And they can follow me on Twitter at Judd Brewer, JUDBREWER.
Well, I'll make sure that's all in the show notes below. But Dr. Judd, thank you so much for coming on the Storybox podcast.